Hello and welcome to episode 9 of my mostly stock career. That was actually a really loud launch right there. But today we are going to Minmus and we have a super massive launcher. As you can see, this thing is huge and I'm actually having to control the throttle on the liquid fuel engine specifically because I don't have fairings around my two landers that I'm bringing with me. So in order for the atmosphere to not basically disintegrate them, I'm keeping the thing below 350 meters per second because that usually keeps the atmosphere at bay and typically nothing will break at that speed. It's only if you start to move too fast. So we had a solid rocket booster stage to get us off the ground really quickly, and then we also had our large liquid fuel tanks that helped us get up to where we are now. We're dropping off those nose cones because although they're not very massive by themselves, the decouplers actually weighed more. I don't want to have to bring them with me on my most efficient stage, which is my very top stage, because they do make a significance in the amount of delta V it has, because it's not a lot of mass on that top stage. So, well, comparatively it's not a lot of mass, I should say. So they actually do have a decent significance. It was worth it to make the bottom stage push through the decoupler weight. And of course, with our orbit complete, I'm just deploying a few solar panels. Unfortunately, I don't have any action groups, so every solar panel on this rig I actually am going to have to manually deploy and undeploy if any case I want to bring them back. Although this thing isn't designed to re-enter, so there's not too much need for that. Now, I've already created my maneuver node for Minmus, and I'm just going to be birding. Of course, I started it a little bit early because I knew I would be staging, and I knew that my second stage was a little less delta V. Now, of course, we're speeding along through this because we've seen this before. However, when we get to the landing, that's going to be a little bit different. But I do want to talk a little bit about this mobile science lab because it's very interesting in how it gives you more science than you would normally get by use of something called data. So I'll talk about that here in a second. Alright, okay, so then, once I figured out which one I want to use of those, we will begin this. Now, let's actually talk about the science lab a little bit while we're still en route to Minmus. And what I want to talk about it is kind of how it works. Now, the mobile processing lab uses both science and data. Now, it can actually transmit science, where you actually transmit it back, and it converts data into science. And of course, it gives you a rate. So if we click on something like, let's say, our lander can, and we do a crew report, we've already collected the crew report, so we don't recover any science. However, because we have a mobile processing lab attached to this vessel, we have the mobile processing lab module plus 9 data. So if we click on that, what happens is we are preparing research data on the crew report while in space high over Kerbal. There we go. Now we've done it. Now we can just say reset because we don't actually want the crew experiment because we already did it. And what we did was we stuck 9 data into this mobile processing lab. So you can see now it's 9 out of 500 and its capacity is 500. So if we take Bob here, for example, he's one of our scientists we're bringing along, and we do a quick EVA report, well, we can't actually do anything with it. Well, that's because Bob isn't attached to the mobile processing lab. If we actually say keep data, and then we try to store the experiment, and then go back in, when we right click on it, we can review the data, and now we can actually access it in the mobile processing lab. So we can get 15 more data from that. Of course, it takes a little bit to actually kind of process. And now we can discard that because, of course, we've already done that experiment. So, because we do have a few experiments to do, let me just grab one of my scientific landers over here and just open some of the modules up. So, apparently we haven't done a goo experiment high over Kerbal. That's actually really good to know. But we're going to grab all of the various sciences that we can. Okay. So this was the mystery goo. We already processed it. I'm actually going to take that experiment out just while I'm here. We'll get 15 more from that. And we'll get 22 from the other experiment. So we already did this one with a temperature scan, so we're going to reset that one. This next one will process, and this does take electric charge to actually process, and it takes electric charge to research. So do make sure you have plenty of solar panels to deal with that. There we go, pressure scan high over Kerbal. We also got that one, so we're actually going to keep that as well. So apparently we didn't do the materials bay. And of course, the data you get depends entirely on how much science the part would normally give you. So because we know that the materials bay gives us more science than the GU experiment, we get more by processing a materials-based study than a GU experiment. But it also takes longer for this actual processing to happen. So I think that's actually all of the data we can collect, at least from this lander. So I'm going to wait for this to finish. We can actually time accelerate through this. Actually, we cannot time accelerate through it. That's odd. Ah, well, we'll just have to wait a moment. And then I'm actually going to grab the science out of the piece, reset my experiments in preparation for the landing, and then talk about how we use this data that we've collected. Alright, so what do we do when we've collected some data? Currently we have 127 out of 500. Well, what we do is we start research. Now, start research will give you a number, such as, if you look, the rate is 0.1715 science per day, and that rate is based off of your scientist's level and how many you have. We have 2 scientists, Bob, who's level 2, and Stelina, who is level 0 stars, I believe. So they're only able to operate at this amount of speed. Now, of course, you can see we've actually gotten a little bit of science in this minuscule amount of time. And I do believe, based on where you do the research, determines the not quality, but quantity of science you get. For example, if we were to do Kerbal-based science in Kerbal's sphere of influence, we would get more science, but we'll test that in a second when we actually enter Minmus's sphere of influence. We'll see if this number ever changes. And of course, this will actually work while you are time accelerating. So, in complete truth, I'm not fully sure how the Science Mobile Processing Lab works. If any of you guys know any exacts, then please do let me know. I really appreciate actually understanding the part more than just knowing that it ramps up as I'm getting further away. Because over the course of this flight, what the science is actually going to happen is it's going to go up when we get high over Minmus, and then it's going to go up again when we get into orbit. So I'm not sure if it's ramping up over time as the scientists are getting used to it, or if it's changing because we're going into a different location, such as Minmus's orbit. But again, I'm not too sure how that part works. Now for this actual burn, because we're so far away from Minmus, what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn both retrograde to slow myself down and radial in, which is the blue circle with the lines going inward. What radial in is doing is it's going to make my path, the blue line, my current trajectory, move toward Minmus, and then by burning retrograde, it's going to slow myself down, which is why I'm able to get this really kind of fast flyby that gets me a rather low periapsis without actually capturing me at my current height, which means I can capture myself when I reach down to the periapsis. This is just me checking that the science bay is again increasing its science rate, which again I have no idea why. But all we have to do is wait for periapsis, where we see some markers from one of the contracts we accepted earlier, but never actually did, nor do I believe we might do. We'll probably do it eventually, but not this time. Currently we're focused on gathering as much science as we can. Already did a crew report. We can just add anything and then reset the experiment. So we'll log temperature, we'll add more data, and we'll log the pressure data and we'll add more. But we're just going to actually reset these experiments immediately because we don't actually want to collect them. We just want the data from them. Now I'm not saying we're not going to get plenty of data from the surface. We're going to be getting more than enough. Since I did bring along 2 landers, I'd only really planned to bring 1, but then they were only about 4 tons apiece. So I thought, why not bring 2 just to actually gather every single biome? Because each one of these landers has 2800 delta V, which means that they can probably each visit 5 to 6 biomes, or 4 to 5 biomes, and get back to the ship where we're going to land, because this ship is going to land and then these things are going to detach from the landing site and move on from there. And I'm actually wondering if that's better, because our orbit is so slow that it might actually be better to detach them now and let them pick their own landing sites. That way I can use the orbit to kind of separate them instead of having them start at the same place. That might actually be beneficial, and then I can land this big thing and have them reattach later, or meet up later. I'll have to decide what I want to do on that part, but now that we have a bunch of new data and we completed a couple contracts, I'm assuming the mission control is going to tell us something like land on Minmus, and I don't necessarily want to miss that just yet, since landing on Minmus would be really nice. Ooh, build a surface outpost on the moon. I want to build a surface outpost on the moon, that sounds like fun. Please note it needs to be a new outpost, landed on the moon. Oh really? I didn't want to land my outpost on the moon, I actually wanted to build it. Let's get extraplanetary launch pads and do that. Actually, unfortunately, this is a mostly stock career, and that's a little too out of stock for me. So, it needs all the general stuff. 12 Kerbals, that's quite a few, and it needs to be stable, but it has a really nice paycheck. Maybe if it's still there, we will grab it later. Okay, now what I'm gonna actually do here is I'm gonna slow my craft down, and I'm gonna detach one of these. The landers. That way I can actually drop one off without actually having to slow it down in orbit. So we're gonna move Bob over here. Good, he made it. Now you can actually just left click on a hatch and say transfer when window pops up, and then you can move them. And we're gonna detach him in a second. I want to start him in the Highlands. So what I'm doing really quickly here is I'm actually hitting Alt F12 to go into the cheat menu so that I can see where all the biomes are. This is mostly because the Highlands, you can sometimes see where they are, but sometimes it's also hard because the main thing that gives them away, which is a darker surface, sometimes isn't always accurate, so I don't want to necessarily miss. Now, you can lower your periapsis with the not the ascending and descending, but the prograde and retrograde vectors, which will actually manipulate it into raising and lowering it, and then you can use the radial vectors to change its position without lowering it. So if we lower our periapsis and then we pull radial in, we'll actually move it back. First, now we need to keep adjusting it. So our periapsis hits 5 kilometers. Strangely enough, I think that's going to be a little too low, since I think the Highlands are actually higher up than that. So 10 kilometers, that should actually be pretty good. So we're actually going to get out of this, make it so the biomes are no longer there, and we're going to wait for this maneuver node. Now there is one thing that I have to be really careful about with these landers, is the fact they have such a low thrust to weight ratio. I need to be very careful not to accidentally go too low early, and then not give myself enough time to stop my descent, in which case I would crash into Minmus, which wouldn't be very good. Now we just want to move away very slightly, making sure not to actually hit it. And, oh great, this is the dark side, which means we don't actually have control. Because this main thing doesn't have a lot of batteries. Apparently we drained it all. Huh. Hopefully we will find some sunlight before too long. And it looks like we just went in the dark, which means we won't be finding any sunlight. It doesn't matter so much for the vessel we just detached as it does for this one, because this one we can just start burning the engine to generate fuel for the other one. This one we actually need to start facing a direction. Actually, is this going to be a problem for this one too? No control whatsoever. Oh, this could actually be quite bad. Actually, we should hit sunlight before we land, so I shouldn't get worried about this one. It's not a problem. Let's just time accelerate and see what happens. So we're just going to wait until we eventually get back into the sun, which we do, in which case I actually just burn radial out mostly to change my orbit so that this thing won't be crashing or getting too close as to possibly crash. And then we grab our probe, or not our probe, but our little probe lander. It's incredibly lightweight, but has tons of science. And we're just going to bring it in closer, of course making a small maneuver burn to adjust for the Minmus's rotation, which is why I'm burning anti-normal, which means towards the South Pole, to try and bring my trajectory down a little bit so that I'm going over the highlands a little bit better. It's kind of hard to see because we haven't actually switched our camera view yet because it doesn't technically believe that we're landing just yet. Although with our periapsis shifting down, our periapsis disappearing, we should be able to see it very soon. Now, while we have plenty of time, I do want to confirm, yep, I am going to be landing in the highlands. Not an issue there. That's good. So we'll just keep slowing down. Now, this is the biggest issue that this craft has, is its reaction time is outstandingly slow. Meaning, I'm probably going to have to burn constantly just not to hit Minmus. Even though Minmus's gravity is so tiny, realistically this probe is only changing its delta V less than 1 per second. So 119, 118, 117, about 1 acceleration is what this thing has, which means it's going to take me 2 more minutes of constant burning just to stop this thing's velocity. Of course, it is going to get a higher thrust-to-weight ratio as time goes on, but it still is going to take quite a while, which is why I didn't want to be too low, otherwise I wouldn't have sufficient time to actually cancel out all of my delta V and be able to land safely. Now, I'm staying in this view because I want to burn prograde, but I want to make sure I'm going to still land in the highlands. So I'm going to keep burning across the horizon until I actually manage to guarantee that this is going to be in the highlands. And it looks like it is, so there we go. We're going to be landing on this big highlands area, which is this much darker surface. Let's deploy the gears. These 4 little tiny landing legs, which are virtually indestructible on Minmus. I've actually crashed one of these things into Minmus on a different save when I was testing out this lander. This lander is actually designed from a different save anyway, I should say that. But when I had originally built this thing and tested it, I had crashed it about 60 meters per second on the surface, and the legs withstood it, which was really impressive. So I actually ended up saving the Kerbal. I think it was Bob that time as well. But yep, we're going to be landing. We do have sufficient time to slow down, which is good. Now this thing will become easier to control as time goes on, because it will have a higher thrust-to-weight ratio. Because every bit of liquid fuel it burns, it gains more thrust-to-weight ratio, and you could actually watch that number climb if we had Kerbal Engineer on this thing. But since we don't have Kerbal Engineer, we can't do that. But it's started off at about 1.5 thrust-to-weight ratio. It's probably working on turning into a 2.0 thrust-to-weight ratio. And by the time the fuel tank's gone, it'll be around 4. Now I have to be careful, because even though we're 6 kilometers up, we're really not. We're probably 1 kilometer at best. So I do have to be careful about not crashing, and apparently it really wants me to time accelerate. I wanted to use physics warp just to slow down faster. But apparently that's not going to happen. So you can actually see the texture refining itself if you have this in high enough quality. And because the texture is refining itself, it means the surface is nearby. So we're probably 300 to 400 feet up now, or 300, 400 meters. And of course that's slowly going down. Now the trick with this lander is actually landing. Because it has such a low thrust to weight ratio, it takes forever for it to respond. Let's actually switch to our surface speed. And we're actually going to hit the ground kind of fast. I'm actually happy nothing broke. I was kind of afraid one of the engines might. But there's the super overpowered tiny landing legs for Minmus, doing their best to keep us alive. And now that we've basically crashed, now we can safely land. Minmus, you don't have to worry about going too slow, just if you do go too quickly, you will bounce. And there we go, successful landing. That actually went rather well, aside from us crashing, but the landing legs, I wasn't really concerned. Now, if you crashed moving about 9-10 meters per second on the moon or in Kerbal, things would be destroyed, but because it's Minmus, the gravity is so low that the way physics for some reason works is it actually is much in your favor. Whereas parts would normally just explode for some reason because the acceleration is so low, even though your velocity can be high, it won't have much of an effect. Unfortunately, this is all we're going to be doing this time, because next time we're going to be flying this thing around all the various biomes to the best of our capability, hopefully without crashing it. So I thank you all for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.